It started with a single word, sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Thief. The accusation was loud enough to make heads turn in the bustling luxury store. Conversations hushed, and the sound of clinking hangers and murmured compliments faded as eyes locked on the scene unfolding in the middle of the showroom. A tall, well-dressed black woman stood frozen, her hands gripping a shopping bag tightly. She had just finished paying moments earlier, but now a uniformed officer blocked her path, his presence casting a dark shadow over her confidence. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of disbelief. She held up the receipt, the crisp paper trembling slightly between her fingers. "Everything in this bag is paid for." The officer didn't even glance at the receipt. His eyes narrowed, and the corners of his mouth twisted into a sneer that carried years of unchecked power. "Sure, that's what they all say," he spat, stepping closer. His voice dropped, but not enough to mask his condescension. "You people always have an excuse." Her stomach churned. "You people." The word struck like a slap. She wasn't naive, she knew what this was. She knew the stares of the shoppers were as heavy as the officer's accusations. But this? Here. She had done everything right. She had followed every rule, carried herself with dignity, and yet, here she was, being stripped of that dignity piece by piece in front of an audience. "I'm asking you to step aside," she said firmly, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I'm not causing a scene. Let me leave." But the officer wasn't interested in letting her go. He leaned in, his voice cold and sharp. "Hand over the bag. Now." "No," she shot back, her tone no longer pleading but commanding. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not giving you what's mine." What happened next unfolded in a blur. The officer's patience snapped, and with it, any pretense of restraint. He grabbed the bag from her hand and threw it to the floor. Items spilled out, a scarf, a pair of sunglasses, a wallet. She bent down instinctively to gather her belongings, and that's when it happened. The kick wasn't just a physical blow, it was a calculated act of degradation. His boot connected with her side, sending her sprawling onto the cold, polished floor. Gasps rippled through the store. A child clung to his mother's leg. A man fumbled with his phone, unsure whether to record or intervene. For a moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. She pushed herself up slowly, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't afraid of the pain in her ribs. No, what burned deeper was the humiliation, the rage bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, his smug grin faltered. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly, her voice a low growl. "A mistake you'll regret." He barked a laugh, stepping back and gesturing to the watching crowd. "Mistake? The only mistake here is you thinking you could waltz in here and pull this off. You think you can flash a receipt and walk away like you belong here? Not on my watch." The weight of his words crushed her for a fleeting moment. He didn't see her, not as a person. He saw a stereotype, a target. But he didn't know her. He didn't know the years of training, the sacrifices, the steel resolve that had carried her through challenges far greater than this. He didn't know who he had just provoked. Still kneeling, she reached into her jacket, her movements deliberate. The officer tensed, one hand hovering near his belt. The tension in the room was palpable, electric. She pulled out a slim black case and flipped it open, revealing a badge that gleamed under the store's bright lights. The 3 letters etched on it seemed to scream louder than any accusation. FBI. The silence shattered. A murmur swept through the crowd, disbelief mixed with awe. The officer's face drained of color as he stared at the badge, then back at her. No, this can't be real." "Oh, it's real," she said, rising to her feet, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "And now, officer, you're the one who needs to explain yourself. Why did you assault an FBI agent? Why did you racially profile me? Why did you think you could get away with this? He stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. I didn't know. Save it, she snapped, stepping forward. I don't want your excuses. I want answers. And trust me, you'll be giving them to people who outrank both of us. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't clap. They stood in stunned silence, watching the man who had held so much power just moments before shrink under the weight of his own actions. But this was just the beginning. What came next would leave the entire department reeling, spark a national conversation, and expose corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The officer thought he had the upper hand, but he didn't realize he was about to lose everything. What will happen to the man who thought he was untouchable? How will this single act of prejudice ripple through his life and the lives of those around him? Stay with us as we unravel a story of justice, reckoning, and a twist that no one saw coming. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To our Black audience and allies, know that this channel is a space of support, respect, and empowerment. Stories like this are written to shine a light on injustice and inspire change, reminding us all of the strength found in resilience and unity. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of storytelling. Together, we can make a difference. Now, sit back and enjoy today's powerful tale. The morning light poured through the windows of the bustling downtown department store, casting long shadows on polished floors and neatly arranged racks of expensive clothing. The air was filled with the faint hum of quiet conversation, the occasional rustle of a shopping bag, and the soft clicking of high heels against the marble tiles. Among the shoppers was Simone Carter, a poised and confident woman in her mid-30s, with sharp features softened by an unshakable calmness. Her professional demeanor wasn't just an accessory, it was a survival skill she had mastered over years of navigating spaces where she was often the only Black woman in the room. Simone had an innate sense of control, a way of commanding attention without raising her voice. She moved through the store with purpose, her eyes scanning racks of scarves and handbags. She had learned early in life to read every situation, every person, every room. As an FBI agent, it was a skill that had served her well. But here, in this upscale department store, she wasn't Simone the agent. She was just Simone, a woman treating herself to a rare moment of indulgence. Her work rarely afforded her the luxury of time. For years, Simone had juggled the weight of her career with the constant pressure of proving her worth in a field dominated by men, many of whom underestimated her. She had grown used to the sidelong glances, the veiled comments, and the unspoken doubts. But this morning, she had promised herself a break. Just an hour to browse, to step out of the shadow of her responsibilities and into the light of simple pleasures. She selected a scarf, a soft, luxurious piece in a rich shade of burgundy, and held it up to the light. The color reminded her of fall, of crisp air and golden leaves, of fleeting moments of peace. She smiled faintly, imagining how it would complement her wardrobe. Her hand lingered over a wallet next, its craftsmanship evident in every stitch. She had always appreciated quality over quantity, a principle that guided her in life and in work. Across the store, Officer Richard Bennett watched her. His uniform was freshly pressed, the badge on his chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Bennett was the kind of man who thrived on authority. He had spent years building a reputation as a no-nonsense enforcer, someone who believed in law and order above all else. To many, he was a hero, a protector of the community. But there was another side to Bennett, one that only a few dared to speak of. His rigid sense of right and wrong often came with a heavy dose of bias, an ingrained prejudice that shaped his view of the world. To Bennett, people like Simone represented trouble. He didn't know her story, didn't see the hours she'd poured into becoming the accomplished woman she was. All he saw was a Black woman in an upscale store, moving with a confidence he found suspicious. He felt a familiar flicker of irritation, a need to assert his authority. In his mind, he wasn't profiling, he was protecting. As Simone approached the counter to pay, she was greeted by the cashier with a warm smile. She placed her items on the counter, pulling out her credit card without hesitation. The transaction was smooth, uneventful, a routine exchange. But Bennett's gaze never left her. He watched as she tucked the receipt into her bag and turned to leave, her heels clicking against the floor with measured precision. Something about her ease, her composure, set him on edge. Simone was halfway to the exit when she heard the voice, sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, ma'am." She stopped, turning to face the officer. His expression was stern, his posture rigid. "I need to see your bag." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "There might be," he said, stepping closer. "Let's take a look." Simone hesitated, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. "I just paid for these," she said, her tone unwavering. "The receipt is right here." Bennett didn't budge. "I'll decide that," he said flatly. "Hand it over." The tension in the air was palpable. Shoppers nearby paused, their curiosity piqued. Simone felt the weight of their stares, the quiet judgment that came from being singled out in such a public space. She took a deep breath, her instincts kicking in. She had been in confrontations before, had faced down suspects far more dangerous than the man in front of her. But this was different. This wasn't about her job. This was about her identity, her dignity. "I'm not handing over anything," she said, her voice steady. "I've done nothing wrong." The exchange drew murmurs from the crowd. A man nearby pulled out his phone, his camera trained on the scene. Simone caught the movement out of the corner of her eye, but her focus remained on Bennett. She could feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, a slow burn that threatened to erupt. But she held it back. She had learned long ago the power of restraint, the strength it took to remain composed in the face of adversity. Bennett's patience was wearing thin. He reached for her bag, his hand brushing against hers. Simone stepped back instinctively, her eyes narrowing. "Don't touch me," she warned, her voice low but firm. He smirked, a cruel glint in his eye. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Without warning, he reached again, this time pulling the bag from her grasp. The contents spilled onto the floor, a cascade of carefully chosen items scattered at their feet. A collective gasp echoed through the store. Simone stared at the mess, her chest tightening. She bent down, her hands moving quickly to gather her belongings. That's when it happened, the kick. It came out of nowhere, a swift and deliberate blow that sent her sprawling to the floor. The pain radiated through her side, sharp and immediate. But it wasn't the physical pain that cut the deepest. It was the humiliation, the sheer audacity of the act. The world seemed to pause. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Simone pushed herself up, her hands trembling. Her mind raced, every fiber of her being screaming against the injustice of the moment. She looked up at Bennett, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and defiance. He stood over her, his smirk replaced by something darker, satisfaction. But what Bennett didn't know, what the crowd couldn't yet see, was that Simone was far from powerless. Beneath the surface of her calm exterior lay a strength forged through years of adversity, a determination that had carried her through every challenge she had ever faced. She would rise, not just from the floor, but from this moment of indignity. And when she did, the man who had sought to diminish her would come to understand the true meaning of accountability. What had begun as a simple shopping trip was about to unravel into a story that would shake the very foundations of the community, exposing truths that had long been hidden in plain sight. The moments after Simone picked herself up from the cold marble floor felt like an eternity. The pain in her ribs was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation burning through her chest. Around her, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional whisper from onlookers who hadn't yet mustered the courage to intervene. Simone's breath was steady, her face calm, but her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts at once. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She wouldn't let it be. Bennett's smirk remained, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he saw her straighten herself. "Stay down next time," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough to feign plausible deniability. "It'll save you the embarrassment." Simone didn't respond. Not yet. Her gaze flicked to the scattered items on the floor, to the receipt still clutched in her hand, and then back to him. She could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, the mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She knew what they were thinking, another confrontation, another black woman being put in her place. But they didn't know her. They didn't know that Simone Carter wasn't just anyone. As she bent down to gather her belongings, a voice cut through the murmurs. "Hey, man, that's enough." A tall man in a gray suit stepped forward, his phone still raised, recording. "She's not doing anything wrong, and you just kicked her. What the hell is wrong with you?" Bennett turned, his posture stiffening as his authority was challenged. "Step back," he barked, his hand hovering over the holster on his belt. "This is a police matter. I suggest you mind your own business unless you want to get involved." "I am involved," the man shot back, undeterred. "We all are. Everyone here saw what you did. That wasn't policing. That was assault." Simone stood, her back straight and her chin high. She met the man's eyes briefly, a silent acknowledgement of his attempt to help. But she didn't need rescuing, not like this. "It's fine," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I'll handle it." The man hesitated, his phone still pointed at Bennett. Simone didn't blame him for his uncertainty. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, the kind of suffocating pressure that made most people freeze. But Simone thrived in it. She had been here before, in different contexts, with different stakes, and she knew how to navigate it. She stepped closer to Bennett, her eyes locked on his. "You've crossed a line," she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough edge to make him flinch. "And now you're going to regret it." Bennett chuckled, a hollow sound that didn't quite mask his unease. "Oh, yeah. And what are you gonna do? Call your lawyer? File a complaint? Good luck with that." Simone smiled faintly, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "I don't need luck. I just need the truth. And the truth has a funny way of coming out, Officer Bennett." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Bennett's bravado wavered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. "Get out of here before I arrest you for resisting an officer," he snapped, his voice sharp. "And take your mess with you." Simone didn't move. Instead, she reached down, picked up her wallet, and placed it back into her bag with deliberate care. "You'll regret this," she said again, her tone softer but no less firm. "Not because of me, but because of what you've done. Actions have consequences, officer. You should have learned that by now." She turned and walked away, her steps measured, her head held high. The crowd parted for her, their silence now laced with a mixture of awe and unease. Bennett stayed rooted to the spot, his hand twitching at his side. He hadn't won, and he knew it. But he didn't understand why. As Simone stepped outside into the crisp air, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The voice on the other end was familiar, steady, and professional. "This is Carter," she said, her tone clipped. "I need a favor. There's been an incident, and I need you to pull every detail you can find on an Officer Richard Bennett. Badge number 48723. I'll explain later." The response was immediate, no questions asked. "Understood. I'll have something for you within the hour." Simone ended the call and took a deep breath, her mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been in her position, every person who had been targeted, humiliated, or silenced. She wouldn't let this go, not this time. Back in the store, Bennett was beginning to feel the cracks in his armor. The murmurs of the crowd had grown louder, and a store manager had approached, her face pale with worry. "Officer," she said hesitantly, "maybe we should call the police department and let them handle this." "I am the police department," Bennett snapped, his frustration spilling over. "And this is under control." The manager didn't look convinced, but she nodded and backed away, clearly unwilling to push further. Bennett turned his attention back to the scattered items on the floor, his jaw tightening as he noticed the man in the gray suit still recording him. "Turn that off," he barked, pointing a finger at the phone. "Not a chance," the man replied coolly. "Someone needs to keep you accountable." Bennett clenched his fists, his composure slipping. He had always been good at maintaining control, at bending situations to his will. But this was different. The woman, Simone, had shaken him in a way he couldn't quite explain. And now, the eyes of the crowd felt like a spotlight, exposing every crack in his carefully constructed facade. As the tension mounted, Simone was already 2 steps ahead. She knew the system, knew how to navigate its complexities and use its tools to her advantage. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was setting the stage for something bigger, something that would force people like Bennett to reckon with the consequences of their actions. The city hummed around her as she made her way to her car, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't know exactly how this would play out, but she knew one thing for certain: the truth would come to light, and Bennett would face it. But what Simone didn't yet realize was how far-reaching the consequences of this encounter would be. The wheels were already in motion, and what started as a single act of defiance would soon spiral into something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow on the worn tiles and scuffed desks. Officer Richard Bennett sat at the far end of the room, his chair tilted back as he tapped a pen against the edge of his desk. His usual confidence had been replaced by a simmering unease. Ever since the incident at the store, something had felt off. Whispers in the halls seemed louder. Eyes lingered a little too long. A few of his colleagues exchanged glances when he walked by, their smirks barely concealed. It wasn't new for officers to gossip, but this time, it felt different. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. The text on the screen was short and cryptic: "We need to talk. Now. Conference room." He frowned, his brow furrowing as he stood and slipped the phone into his pocket. The sender wasn't identified, but the tone left no room for argument. The conference room was empty when he arrived, the long table polished to a shine. The blinds on the glass walls were half closed, offering a partial view of the bullpen. He paced for a moment before the door creaked open behind him. Chief Walters entered, his face unreadable, followed closely by 2 men in suits. Bennett stiffened immediately, his instincts screaming at him to be on guard. The men didn't wear badges, but everything about them, from their clipped movements to the quiet authority they carried, said Federal. "What's this about?" Bennett asked, his voice sharper than he intended. He glanced at the chief, searching for some kind of reassurance, but Walters offered none. "Take a seat, Officer Bennett," one of the men said, his voice steady but firm. "We have some questions." Bennett's chest tightened. "Questions? About what?" He sat reluctantly, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "I don't understand. If this is about the incident at the store, I already filed my report." The second man raised an eyebrow. "Oh, we've read your report. Thoroughly. But there are a few discrepancies we'd like to address." Bennett's heart sank. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, but his mind raced. Discrepancies? What could they possibly mean? He had written the report carefully, omitting anything that could raise suspicion. He had done this before. He was good at this. "Discrepancies," he echoed, his voice tight. "Like what?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a briefcase and pulled out a slim file, sliding it across the table. Bennett hesitated before opening it, his stomach twisting as he scanned the contents. Photos. Screenshots. Transcripts. His own face stared back at him from a still frame, captured mid-smirk as he stood over the woman at the store. The video had gone viral, but he hadn't expected it to be here, in front of him, dissected and catalogued by federal agents. "We've been reviewing your history, Officer Bennett," the first man said, his tone measured. "And what we've found is troubling. This incident isn't the first time you've been accused of misconduct. In fact, it's part of a larger pattern." Bennett bristled, his defenses kicking in. "Hold on a second. I don't know who you think you are, but I've been on this force for 10 years. My record speaks for itself." "Yes," the man replied coolly. "It does. And it's littered with complaints, most of which were mysteriously dismissed or buried. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. And now this." Bennett's gaze darted to the chief, who had remained silent. "Chief, you're not seriously entertaining this, are you? You know me. You know my work." Walters sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I do know you, Richard. And I've overlooked a lot. But this is different. The FBI is involved now." The words hit Bennett like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled. FBI? Why? What did this have to do with them? His thoughts spiraled until the second man spoke again, his voice cutting through the fog. "Agent Carter has filed a formal complaint. She's not just pursuing this as a victim. She's pursuing it as an investigator." Bennett's blood ran cold. Carter. The woman at the store. The badge she'd flashed came rushing back to him, the gleam of it still burned into his memory. FBI. He had dismissed it as a bluff, a tactic to throw him off. But now, sitting across from two federal agents with his own chief refusing to meet his eyes, he realized how wrong he had been. "She set this up," he spat, his voice rising. "This is a setup. She's using her position to come after me." She's doing her job," the first man interrupted, his tone sharp. "Something you failed to do. This isn't just about one incident, officer. This is about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long." Bennett's fists clenched under the table. He wanted to fight back, to shout, to defend himself. But the evidence in the file was damning. The video alone was enough to ruin him, and the weight of the complaints they mentioned loomed like a storm cloud. He had always believed he was untouchable, protected by the thin blue line and the unwritten rules of loyalty within the force. But now, he could feel the walls closing in. As the agents continued to lay out their case, his mind drifted to Carter. He pictured her calm defiance, the way she had looked at him that day, not with fear, but with the kind of resolve that sent a chill down his spine. She had planned this. She had seen him for exactly what he was, and she had made her move. And now, as much as he hated to admit it, she had the upper hand. The second man's voice pulled him back to the present. "You have two choices, Officer Bennett. Cooperate with the investigation, or face charges that will destroy whatever is left of your career. Either way, this ends here." Bennett's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless. The realization was as humiliating as it was infuriating. But what shook him more was the thought of Carter, out there somewhere, pulling the strings. She had turned the tables, and he had no idea what she would do next. This wasn't over. Not yet. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had underestimated her, and now, he was paying the price. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard Bennett sat in his apartment, staring at the dim glow of his television. The local news played on a loop, the anchor's voice a distant hum that barely registered. His own name echoed in the headlines, paired with words like investigation, misconduct, and racial profiling. It felt surreal, as though he were watching someone else's life unravel. But it wasn't someone else, it was him. The story had spread like wildfire, and the accompanying video had been replayed so many times that he could practically hear the collective judgment of the world outside his door. The sharp knock at his door broke through his spiraling thoughts. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent. He rose reluctantly, his steps heavy as he approached the door and peered through the peephole. His chest tightened when he saw who was standing on the other side. Simone Carter. Her expression was calm but firm, the kind of look that left no room for debate. She was dressed sharply, her posture confident as always. Bennett hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Finally, with a deep breath, he opened the door, his jaw tight. "What the hell are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and strained. Simone stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered living room before landing back on him. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Bennett," she said evenly. "I'm here because you need to hear this face to face." He closed the door behind her, his mind racing. "Hear what? That you're trying to ruin my life? That you're dragging my name through the mud?" She raised an eyebrow, her expression unyielding. "I'm not dragging your name through anything. You did that all on your own." Her words hit harder than he expected. He bristled, his defenses flaring. "You don't know anything about me. You think you can walk in here and lecture me about my life?" Simone didn't flinch. She took a step closer, her voice steady but laced with intensity. "You're right. I don't know everything about you. But I know enough. I know what you did. Not just to me, but to countless others. I know the complaints that were swept under the rug, the lives you've impacted because of your arrogance and prejudice. And now, for the first time, you're being held accountable." Bennett clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Accountable?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You think this is accountability? This is a witch hunt. You're out to destroy me because I made a mistake, a mistake." Simone's voice cut through his like a knife. Her composure cracked just enough for a flash of anger to show. "What you did wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to set your alarm. A mistake is misplacing your keys. What you did was deliberate. You saw me, judged me, and acted on every prejudice you've carried your entire life. And now, you're angry because the consequences are finally catching up with you." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on him. She didn't look away, her gaze unwavering as she took a step back. "I came here because I wanted you to understand something," she said, her tone softer now but no less resolute. "This isn't about vengeance. It's not about ruining your life. It's about justice. For me. For everyone who's ever been in my position. And for everyone who still will be if people like you aren't held accountable." Bennett shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're some kind of hero," he said bitterly. "But you're not. You're just as vindictive as everyone else." Simone's expression didn't waver. "If that's what you need to believe, fine. But deep down, you know the truth. This isn't about me. It's about you. About the choices you've made, the harm you've caused, and the system that's protected you for far too long." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to refute them. But he couldn't. Not really. The evidence was undeniable, the weight of his own actions crushing him from within. He turned away, his hands running through his hair as he tried to process the storm raging in his mind. "Why are you here?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. "What do you want from me?" Simone's eyes softened just slightly, though her resolve remained intact. "I want you to understand," she said simply. "I want you to look in the mirror and see yourself for who you really are. Not the hero you pretend to be, but the man who's spent his career abusing his power. And I want you to do better. Not for me. For yourself. Bennett laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. Do better? It's a little late for that, don't you think? It's never too late, Simone said firmly. But it's up to you. No one can make that choice for you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation settled over the room, heavy and unrelenting. Bennett finally looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something he couldn't quite name. You really believe that? He asked quietly. Simone nodded. I do. But belief isn't enough. It has to be followed by action. And whether or not you take that step is entirely up to you. She turned to leave, her steps deliberate as she made her way to the door. Bennett watched her go, a knot tightening in his chest. He wanted to say something, to argue, to defend himself. But the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stand there, the echoes of her words reverberating in his mind. As the door clicked shut behind her, Bennett sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He didn't know what his next move would be, but for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could bear it. The morning after Simone's visit, Richard Bennett woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the bedside table. The sunlight filtering through the blinds felt sharper than usual, cutting across his face like a blade. He squinted, groaning as he reached for the device. The notifications on the screen were a blur of emails, missed calls, and text messages, all bearing the same undercurrent of urgency. He hesitated before opening them, his chest heavy with the knowledge that nothing good awaited him on the other side. His instincts were correct. The department had issued a formal statement regarding the investigation. His suspension, once an internal decision meant to minimize public fallout, had now been made official and highly publicized. His name was plastered across every news outlet, paired with phrases like misconduct investigation and racist policing scandal. The statement was clinical, a careful attempt to distance the department from the weight of his actions, but its implications were clear. Bennett was on his own now. He tossed the phone onto the bed, his frustration mounting. The walls of his apartment felt closer than ever, the air suffocating. For years, he had believed in his own invincibility, in the unspoken protections that came with the badge. He had thought himself untouchable, shielded by a system that had always been more interested in preserving its image than holding its officers accountable. But now, that shield had been stripped away, leaving him exposed. By midday, he found himself pacing the length of his living room, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts. The conversations with Simone and the federal agents replayed on a loop in his head, each word cutting deeper than the last. He hated the way she had looked at him, not with anger or hatred, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty that unnerved him. She had seen through him, past the carefully crafted facade of authority and power, and she had exposed what lay beneath. The knock at his door startled him, his heart leaping into his throat. He hesitated, his instincts telling him to ignore it, but the knock came again, firmer this time. When he opened the door, he was met with the last person he expected to see, Chief Walters. The older man's expression was unreadable, his presence heavy with unspoken tension. "Chief," Bennett said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Walters stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on Bennett. "I needed to see you," he said simply, his tone grave. "We need to talk." Bennett gestured for him to sit, though neither of them made a move toward the couch. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until Walters finally spoke. "You've put me in a difficult position, Richard," he began, his voice low. "The department, the city, we're all under a microscope right now because of you." Bennett bristled, his defenses rising instinctively. "I'm being made into a scapegoat," he said bitterly. "You know that. This isn't just about me. It's about the choices you've made," Walters interrupted, his tone sharp. "Don't sit here and pretend like this is happening to you. You did this. You put yourself in this position. Bennett's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. I was doing my job, he snapped. I was protecting this community. Were you? Walters shot back, his voice rising for the first time. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've spent years abusing the power that job gave you. And now, you're paying the price. The words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. Bennett wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't ignore the truth in Walter's eyes. The chief sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly as the anger gave way to something heavier, disappointment. I've known you a long time, Richard, he said, his tone softer now. And I've looked the other way more times than I care to admit. But this? This is different. You've crossed a line, and there's no going back. Bennett sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done, not just to himself, but to the people he had sworn to protect. The faces of those he had wronged flashed in his mind, each one a reminder of the harm he had caused. What happens now? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Walters hesitated, the lines on his face deepening. The investigation will continue. The FBI isn't backing down, and neither is Carter. And frankly, they shouldn't. You need to answer for this, Richard. You need to take responsibility. The words felt like a final blow, shattering whatever illusions Bennett had left about his ability to salvage his career. He nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. Walters rose, his gaze lingering on Bennett for a moment before he turned to leave. Before he reached the door, Bennett spoke again, his voice hoarse. Do you think there's any chance to fix this? To make it right? Walters paused, his hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried a weight that hit Bennett squarely in the chest. That depends on you. But some things, Richard, some things you can't undo. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Bennett alone once again. The words echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain that refused to let him rest. He stared out the window, the city bustling below, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of the consequences bearing down on him. Some things, you can't undo. But was there still a chance to atone? And if there was, would he take it? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as he faced the reality of the choices that had brought him here. The days following Chief Walters' visit weighed heavily on Richard Bennett. Every hour felt like a lifetime, his thoughts running in endless loops as he replayed every mistake, every misstep, and every moment he wished he could undo. His apartment, once a space he took comfort in, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a bubble of self-loathing and confusion. He had barely eaten, the plates of untouched food piling up in the sink. His phone buzzed incessantly, the constant notifications reminding him that the world outside wasn't going to let him hide forever. His name was plastered across headlines, the subject of fiery debates on talk shows, and dissected in online forums. He couldn't escape it, not in the news, not in his thoughts, not in his dreams. The knock on his door that evening was so unexpected that it startled him. For a moment, he didn't move, his body frozen in place as he stared at the door. When the knock came again, slightly louder this time, he forced himself to his feet. His steps were slow and hesitant, dread settling in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't expecting anyone, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for company. But curiosity, or maybe some sense of obligation, propelled him forward. When he opened the door and saw Simone Carter standing there, his heart sank. She stood in the dimly lit hallway, her posture straight and her expression calm but firm. There was an air of determination about her, a quiet strength that unsettled him. For a moment he considered slamming the door in her face, but he knew that would only make things worse. With a resigned sigh, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "You're persistent," he said flatly as she stepped inside, her eyes briefly scanning the room before landing on him. Simone didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood in the middle of the living room, her arms at her sides, her gaze steady and unwavering. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until she finally spoke. "I didn't think I'd need to come back here," she began, her tone measured but firm. "But after hearing about your suspension and seeing how this is playing out, I realize there's still more you need to understand." Bennett crossed his arms and leaned against the back of the couch, his eyes narrowing. "Understand?" he echoed bitterly. "What's left to understand? I've been suspended, my name's all over the news, and I'm the city's new punching bag. I get it. I've already lost everything." Simone's expression didn't change, though a flicker of something, pity, frustration, or perhaps both, passed through her eyes. "If you think this is just about what you've lost, then you still don't get it," she said. "This isn't about you, Bennett. It never was. This is about the people you've hurt. The people who didn't have the power to fight back. And the fact that you still see yourself as the victim here is exactly why I'm standing in your living room right now." Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he snapped. "Watching me squirm, watching my life fall apart. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Revenge." Simone's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "If you think I'm here for revenge, you're giving yourself too much credit," she said sharply. "This isn't about me. This is about accountability. Something you've clearly never had to face until now." Bennett's fists clenched at his sides, his frustration bubbling over. "Accountability," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Right. Because dragging my name through the mud and turning me into a public enemy is all about accountability." Simone didn't flinch. "It's not about dragging your name through anything," she said firmly. "It's about exposing the truth. And the truth is that you abused your power, repeatedly, and you thought you could get away with it. Well, now you're not. And instead of taking responsibility, you're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself." The word stung, but Bennett refused to let it show. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady himself. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression was a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. "What do you want from me, Carter?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Why are you really here?" Simone took a deep breath, her gaze softening slightly. "I want you to understand the damage you've done," she said. "Not just to me, but to every person who's ever been on the other side of your badge. I want you to stop hiding behind excuses and start taking responsibility. Because until you do, nothing will ever change. Not for you, not for the people you've hurt, and not for this city." Bennett stared at her, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't fully articulate. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to push back against everything she was saying. But deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent years justifying his actions, convincing himself that he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting the community. But in reality, he had been protecting himself, his power, his authority, his image. And now, all of it was crumbling around him. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." Simone's expression softened further, though her resolve remained intact. "It's not about fixing it," she said gently. "Some things can't be fixed. But you can start by owning what you've done. By admitting the truth, not just to the world but to yourself. And then you start making better choices. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But it's the only way forward." Bennett nodded slowly, her words sinking in more deeply than he expected. He didn't know if he was capable of what she was asking, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The possibility of redemption, of change, seemed distant but not impossible. And that thought, however faint, was enough to keep him from giving up entirely. Simone turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him. "One more thing," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't about proving anything to anyone else. This is about doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Especially when no one's watching." With that, she left, closing the door behind her. Bennett stood there for a long moment, staring at the door as her words echoed in his mind. The silence of the apartment felt heavier now, but it was no longer suffocating. Instead, it felt like a challenge, a call to action. And for the first time in his life, Richard Bennett found himself willing to rise to it. The days after Simone Carter's visit felt different for Richard Bennett. The suffocating weight of silence that had hung over his apartment seemed to shift, though it wasn't entirely gone. It was as though her words had cracked something inside him, letting in just enough light to reveal the mess he had been avoiding. He didn't know where to begin or how to navigate the wreckage of his actions, but for the first time, he acknowledged it. He couldn't hide from it anymore. He spent hours poring over the file he had managed to piece together from memory, the complaints, the reports, the incidents he had brushed off as trivial or part of the job. Each page felt like a punch to the gut, a painful reminder of the choices he had made and the people he had hurt. He had always dismissed these accusations as misunderstandings or exaggerations, but now, reading through them with Simone's words echoing in his mind, he saw them differently. They weren't misunderstandings. They were truths, truths he had refused to face for years. His thoughts were interrupted by the persistent buzz of his phone. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told him he needed to answer it. He hesitated for a moment before pressing the button, his voice strained as he spoke. "Bennett." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but carried an edge of urgency. "Officer Bennett, this is Special Agent Monroe with the FBI. We need to speak with you. In person." Bennett's grip on the phone tightened. "About what?" There was a brief pause, the weight of it pressing against his chest. "You'll understand when we meet. Can you come to the Federal Building tomorrow morning?" He wanted to refuse, to hang up and retreat further into his isolation. But something in Monroe's tone, firm yet measured, left him with little choice. "I'll be there," he said reluctantly, ending the call before the agent could respond. That night, he barely slept. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. By the time morning arrived, his nerves were frayed, but he forced himself to get dressed and make the drive downtown. The Federal Building loomed ahead, its stark, imposing architecture a reminder of the power it represented. As he stepped inside, the cold air and sterile lighting did little to calm him. Agent Monroe was waiting for him in a small, windowless conference room. The man was composed, his sharp suit and steady demeanor exuding authority. Simone was already seated across from him, her presence both a comfort and a source of unease. She didn't say anything as Bennett entered, but her eyes met his, their silent intensity speaking volumes. "Thank you for coming," Monroe began, gesturing for Bennett to take a seat. "We're here because there's an opportunity for you to make things right, or at least take the first step." Bennett frowned, his defenses rising instinctively. "Make things right? How?" Monroe leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "We've been investigating patterns of misconduct within your department, and your case has brought a lot of things to light. This isn't just about you, Officer Bennett. It's about a culture that has allowed this behavior to go unchecked for far too long." Bennett shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "So, what? You want me to be your scapegoat? To take the fall for everyone else?" "No," Monroe said firmly. "We want you to help us. You've been part of this system for years. You know how it works, the people involved, the ways it's been manipulated. If you're willing to cooperate, you could provide valuable insight into how to dismantle it." Simone finally spoke, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "This is your chance, Bennett. Your chance to do something that actually matters. To stop hiding behind excuses and start making a real difference. He turned to her, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You think it's that simple? That I just spill everything I know and suddenly I'm a good guy? It doesn't work like that. No, it doesn't, she replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. But it's a start. And right now, that's all you've got. The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. Bennett's mind raced, torn between his instinct to protect himself and the growing realization that he couldn't keep running from this. He looked at Monroe, then back at Simone, his voice quieter now. And if I do this? What happens to me? Monroe's gaze didn't waver. That depends on how much you're willing to cooperate. But understand this, it's not about what happens to you. It's about the bigger picture, the lives that could be changed by exposing the truth. Bennett leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. He had spent years justifying his actions, convincing himself that he was doing the right thing. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done and the chance to make amends, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. I need time to think, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe nodded. Take the time you need. But don't take too long. This window won't stay open forever. As the meeting ended, Simone lingered behind, her eyes fixed on Bennett as he stood to leave. He hesitated, sensing that she had something more to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost gentle. You asked me once if I thought there was a way to fix this, she said. And I told you it wasn't about fixing it. But this is a way to start. It's not easy, and it won't make everything right. But it's better than doing nothing. He didn't respond right away, his eyes searching hers for some sign of forgiveness, of understanding. Why do you care so much? He asked quietly. After everything, why do you even bother? Her expression softened, but her resolve remained. Because this isn't about you or me. It's about something bigger. And because if there's even a chance you can change, it's worth trying. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Bennett alone in the conference room. He stared at the empty chair she had left behind, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might be right. That even in the face of everything he had done, there was still a chance, however small, to make things right. As he left the building and stepped into the crisp morning air, he felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him take the next step. Whatever that step would be, he knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he was willing to try. The federal case unfolded quietly but methodically over the next several months, far from the public eye. Richard Bennett, faced with a choice between silence and cooperation, had initially hesitated, struggling with the fear of what full disclosure might mean for his already shattered life. But the longer he sat with the weight of his actions, the clearer it became that Simone Carter's words were right. This wasn't about redemption, it was about responsibility. Slowly, cautiously, he began to talk. His cooperation revealed a deeply entrenched network of misconduct within the department, patterns of cover-ups, skewed reports, and officers emboldened by a lack of accountability. Bennett's testimony was damning, implicating several high-ranking individuals who had, for years, enabled and even encouraged these behaviors. It wasn't easy. The backlash from former colleagues was swift and brutal. Threats, accusations of betrayal, and the cold, isolating silence from those he once called friends became his daily reality. But through it all, Bennett held his ground. For the first time, he felt he was doing something that mattered, even if it came at great personal cost. Simone Carter followed the case closely but from a distance. She didn't intervene, didn't reach out, but her influence was felt in every step of the process. Her determination to hold the system accountable had sparked a chain reaction, and her presence in the courtroom during key hearings served as a reminder of the stakes. She watched as Bennett's testimony helped dismantle the web of corruption, her expression unreadable as the names of complicit officers and their superiors were read aloud in court. Bennett's path wasn't easy, nor was it linear. Even as he worked with federal agents to bring justice to a broken system, he wrestled with the consequences of his past. He attended court-ordered counseling sessions, a condition of his cooperation, where he was forced to confront the deep-seated biases and unchecked anger that had shaped so much of his career. It was an uncomfortable, often painful process, but one he didn't shy away from. For the first time, he began to see himself clearly, not as a victim, but as someone who had caused harm and was now tasked with the work of rebuilding, not his image, but his integrity. The fallout from the investigation was seismic. Several high-ranking officers were removed from their positions, some facing criminal charges. New policies and oversight measures were introduced, the beginnings of a systemic change that had once seemed impossible. It was far from perfect, and Simone knew there was still a long way to go, but it was a start. For her, that was enough. As for Bennett, the cooperation agreement spared him from prison, but he knew he would never wear a badge again. His name remained a lightning rod for public scrutiny, a symbol of everything wrong with the system he had once upheld. But he didn't fight it. He accepted it as part of his penance, choosing instead to focus on what he could control. He took a job at a non-profit organization that provided legal support and advocacy for victims of police misconduct, a role he never imagined for himself but one that felt, strangely, like a step toward making amends. Simone's career continued to flourish, her work on the case earning her both respect and criticism. She didn't care much for accolades, but she felt a quiet pride in what had been accomplished. When Bennett reached out to her months later, requesting a meeting, she agreed, though she wasn't sure what to expect. They met at a small coffee shop, the atmosphere far less charged than their previous encounters. "Why did you agree to see me?" he asked after a moment of awkward silence. She looked at him, her gaze steady but not unkind. "Because you asked," she said simply. "And because I wanted to see for myself if you'd actually changed." He nodded, accepting her words without argument. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice quieter now. "I just wanted to thank you. For holding me accountable. For not letting me hide." Simone regarded him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't do it for you," she said, though her tone lacked the sharpness it once held. "But I'm glad you're trying." They parted ways on a note of cautious understanding, both aware that their shared history would always be complicated. For Simone, the fight for justice continued, a never-ending battle that required constant vigilance. For Bennett, life was quieter but no less challenging. He had lost much, but in the process, he had found something unexpected, a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. In the end, neither became a hero in the traditional sense, but their choices left ripples that extended far beyond their individual lives. Their story wasn't neat or tied up with a bow, but it was real, and it carried with it the weight of hard truths and the possibility of change. The story of Richard Bennett and Simone Carter serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of justice, accountability, and redemption. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own roles in the systems we participate in and the ways we can challenge them. What does it truly mean to change? How do we balance the need for accountability with the possibility of growth? And perhaps most importantly, how do we ensure that justice isn't just a word but a reality for everyone, regardless of who they are? What are your thoughts on their journey? Do you believe that redemption is possible for someone like Bennett, or do some actions leave an indelible mark that can never truly be erased? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this powerful story. If you enjoyed this tale of justice, accountability, and the fight for change, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke thought. Don't forget to hit the like button if this story resonated with you, and stay tuned for more narratives that keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.